I never should have taken the job. House sitting for a couple of weeks sounded like an easy way to make some cash, but what happened at the old house on Briarwood Lane will haunt me forever. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Wilkes, were a retired couple off to Europe for their long-awaited vacation. Their home was a beautiful but old two-story Victorian, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. With creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper, it had that sense of history that some people find charming. I found it creepy. The first few days were uneventful. I watered the plants, fed the cat, and basically did nothing but lounge around watching TV. The Wilkes had left detailed instructions for everything, except for the attic. On the last page of their note, in bold red ink, they'd written, "Do not enter the attic under any circumstances." I thought it was weird, but didn't question it. I wasn't planning on going up there anyway. Then things started to change. The first thing I noticed was the cat, Smokey. He became restless, pacing around the house with his fur bristling. He stared at the ceiling a lot, eyes wide and unblinking, his tail twitching like something had spooked him. I shrugged it off. Animals are strange sometimes, I figured. But then, during the night, I began to hear noises. At first, it was soft, like a slow dragging sound coming from above. I dismissed it as the old house settling, but by the third night, the noises grew louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps right above my bedroom. I told myself it was nothing, maybe squirrels in the attic, but there was this part of me that knew better. There was something wrong. Every time the footsteps started, Smokey would hiss and bolt under the couch. It got worse after I found the door. The house was old, and I hadn't explored every inch of it yet. But one afternoon, while cleaning in the back hallway, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was small, almost hidden in the shadows of a narrow corner. It wasn't listed in the house instructions, and I felt a chill when I touched the handle. The door led to a small, dim staircase going up. It had to be the way to the attic, but why didn't the Wilkes mention it? I shut the door and tried to forget about it. But that night, the footsteps returned, heavier than ever. They weren't just above me. They were coming down the stairs. I swear I could hear each creak, every groan of the wooden steps bending under something's weight. I lay frozen in my bed, staring at the door to my room, waiting for it to open. It never did, but I barely slept, and the next morning I was exhausted, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. That's when I decided to call the Wilkes. Mrs. Wilkes picked up after a few rings. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told her about the noises, about the attic. I didn't mention the hidden door. I don't know why, but something inside me warned against it. "Oh, the house can be a little noisy," she said, her voice too calm for my liking. "It's very old, you know, but don't worry, dear. It's nothing to be concerned about. Just stay out of the attic." The line clicked dead before I could ask anything else. That's when I knew something was very wrong. That night, the footsteps started again, but this time, they didn't stop. They moved down the hall, stopping right outside my bedroom door. I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like something was standing just inches away. I was done. I threw the blankets off and bolted for the front door. But when I got to the hallway, I saw it. The attic door, the one I had closed, was wide open. I froze. I could feel the cold air coming down from the attic, a damp, musty chill that sent goosebumps crawling up my skin. Smokey hissed from somewhere behind me, and I knew I wasn't alone. I should have run, but instead something pulled me toward the stairs. I wanted to see. I needed to see. Step by step, I climbed the staircase, my heart hammering in my chest. The air grew colder, and the smell of rot became overwhelming. I reached the top and saw a small, dusty room, empty except for an old rocking chair. It was moving, slowly, back and forth like someone had just been sitting in it. And then I heard it, a whisper. My name. Soft but unmistakable. I turned to run, but something grabbed me, icy fingers closing around my wrist. I screamed and yanked free, tumbling down the stairs. When I hit the floor, I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. I never went back. I found out later from a neighbor that the Wilkes' house had a dark history. The previous owner, an old man who had lived there alone, died in the attic. They say he went mad, locking himself away up there for days before his body was found. No one ever explained why. The Wilkes never mentioned any of this when they hired me, of course. They moved out of the house shortly after their vacation, selling it to the first buyer who didn't ask too many questions. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. And I wonder if the next house sitter will hear them too. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I didn't think twice when my friend Mia asked me to house sit for her parents. I'd done it before, watered the plants, fed their old dog Rusty, and spent a few nights in their cozy suburban home. It was always an easy gig. They lived in one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where nothing ever happens, the kind of place that felt almost too normal. This time, Mia's parents were going away for 2 weeks on a cruise, and Mia had to leave for a business trip. She was desperate, so I said yes. The money was good, and I figured I'd just get some time to relax. But I should have asked more questions before I agreed. The first few days were just as dull as I expected. I made myself comfortable, catching up on shows, enjoying the peace and quiet. Rusty, the old golden retriever, barely moved from his spot by the living room window. He was getting on in years, and I figured he was just too tired to be bothered with anything. The neighborhood was eerily quiet at night. Too quiet. The silence pressed in on me, especially after dark, when the streetlights cast long shadows across the road. There was something unsettling about how still everything became after sunset, like the whole place just went to sleep all at once. On the third night, as I was getting ready for bed, something odd happened. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the house, but then it came again. Tap, 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 sharp and rhythmic. It was coming from the living room. I padded down the hall, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. When I entered the living room, the sound stopped. Rusty was still lying by the window, his eyes half closed. Nothing seemed out of place, but something was off. I could feel it in the air, a heaviness, like the room had shifted when I wasn't looking. I checked the front door, made sure it was locked, and told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me. The tapping returned the next night, only this time it was louder, more insistent. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the sharp taps coming from the window in the living room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Rusty had started to whine, a low, pitiful sound that made my skin crawl. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hallway. The tapping grew louder as I approached the living room, and this time Rusty was standing by the window, his body tense, his ears pricked up. His tail was between his legs, and he let out a soft growl as I entered the room. I shone the flashlight at the window, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the swaying branches of the trees. But the tapping, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room. The sound seemed to be coming from the far corner, near the old grandfather clock that hadn't worked in years. I slowly approached, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand, and then I saw it. A face, pale, with hollow eyes and a crooked smile, staring back at me from the glass of the window. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. But when I looked again, the face was gone. Just my reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down I knew something was wrong with this house. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept expecting to hear the tapping again, but the house was eerily silent. The next morning, I called Mia. I tried to sound casual, but I could hear the panic in my voice as I told her about the strange noises, the face in the window. "Oh, that," she said, her voice oddly dismissive. "It's probably just the old man." "What old man?" I asked, my stomach dropping. Mia hesitated. "I didn't want to freak you out, but my parents have mentioned seeing him a few times. They think it's the ghost of the man who used to live there before they bought the place. He died in the house, in the living room, I think. Some nights they hear tapping too." I felt cold all over. "You didn't think to mention this before?" "I didn't think it was real," she said quickly. "I mean, I've never seen anything when I've stayed there. I thought they were just imagining it." I hung up, not wanting to hear any more. Mia's casual explanation didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. I was staying in a house haunted by some old man's ghost, and no one thought to tell me. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it didn't stop. It grew louder, faster, like someone was hammering on the walls. Rusty barked furiously, his paws scratching at the door as if he was trying to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my keys, I ran out of the house, Rusty trailing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the house, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the window, where Rusty had been lying earlier, was the old man. His face was pale, his eyes empty, and he was staring right at me. His lips curled into that same crooked smile I'd seen before. I didn't wait to see if he would move. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. I never went back. Mia apologized 1,000 times, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd barely escaped something terrible. And now, every time I pass a house with a window like the one on Briarwood Lane, I can't help but glance at it, half expecting to see that face staring back at me. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When my friend Lisa asked me to watch her family's old farmhouse for a weekend, I eagerly accepted. I had never spent much time in the country, and a few days in the peaceful countryside sounded perfect. Little did I know that weekend would turn into a nightmare. I arrived on Friday evening, the sun setting behind the rolling hills. The house was charming but ancient, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and a slight draft that sent shivers down my spine. As I stepped inside, a wave of musty air hit me, and I felt as if I was stepping back in time. The living room was filled with antique furniture, dusty family portraits hanging on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me. Lisa's family had warned me about the quirks of the house. Just ignore the noises, she had said with a half-hearted smile. It's just the old place settling. I laughed it off, confident that I could handle whatever came my way. The first night was uneventful. I settled into the large, comfy couch with a bowl of popcorn and a movie. Just as I began to relax, I heard a soft thud from upstairs. I paused the movie, straining to listen. Nothing. I shook my head and resumed watching, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. As I climbed the staircase, the old wood groaned under my weight. I opened the door to the guest room, which had a small window overlooking the fields. I settled into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, glancing around the dimly lit room. The sound had come from downstairs. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity pulled me out of bed. I tiptoed down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The living room looked undisturbed, but as I turned to leave, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just left. A chill crept down my spine. I knew I had locked it when I came in. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. Silence answered me. I stepped outside, peering into the darkened yard. The moon illuminated the garden, casting eerie shadows on the ground. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I felt a sense of unease wash over me. Was I really alone? Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed through the air, too faint to understand, but enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. I backed away, retreating inside and slamming the door shut. I locked it, trying to steady my breathing. I convinced myself it was just my nerves and went back to bed, but sleep eluded me. The next morning, I woke up feeling disoriented. I glanced at the clock. It was past 10. I hurriedly got dressed and made myself breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I sat at the kitchen table, I noticed an old newspaper clipping hanging on the wall. It featured an article about a tragic accident that had occurred in the house decades ago. A young girl had fallen down the stairs and died. The article detailed how the family had never fully recovered from the loss. I felt a wave of sympathy wash over me, but it did little to ease my anxiety. The day passed slowly, the sun high in the sky and the birds chirping outside. I decided to explore the property, hoping to distract myself from the strange occurrences. The fields stretched endlessly, with wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. It was beautiful, but unsettling. The peaceful scenery contrasted sharply with the anxiety gnawing at my gut. That night, I prepared for bed with a sense of dread hanging over me. As I climbed the stairs, the same thud echoed in my mind. I hesitated at the top, glancing back toward the hallway. Just as I was about to enter my room, I heard a child's laughter coming from downstairs. I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. I grabbed my phone, using its light to guide me down the dark corridor. The laughter continued, echoing through the halls, sending chills down my spine. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I reached the staircase and peered down into the darkness. The laughter had stopped, but I could hear a faint humming, like a lullaby drifting up from below. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs, the familiar creaks echoing in the silence. As I entered the living room, I felt a cold draft sweep through, extinguishing the warmth of the day. The front door stood wide open again, swinging slowly on its hinges. I could have sworn I had locked it. My heart raced, and I stepped outside, clutching my phone tightly. The yard was still. The moon hung low, illuminating the path ahead. As I stood on the porch, I felt a tug at my sleeve. I whipped around, but no one was there. I stumbled back, and suddenly the whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like a frigid wind. "Help? Me?" A soft voice called out from the shadows. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the front gate, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back, and for a split second I saw a small figure standing in the doorway, pale, with dark eyes staring right at me. I didn't stop to question it. I threw open the gate and bolted toward my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door. I sped down the dirt road, not looking back. The farmhouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the memory of that night haunted me. The whispers, the laughter, and the figure standing in the doorway would stay with me long after I left that cursed place. I never returned to Lisa's family farmhouse. And I certainly never agreed to house sit again. Some places hold on to their secrets, and some spirits refuse to let go. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I thought house sitting would be a breeze. My neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, asked me to watch her place while she visited her daughter across the country for a month. The payment was decent, and I figured I could use the extra cash. Little did I know that her house held secrets I never could have imagined. Mrs. Thompson lived in a quaint, older home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering oaks that whispered secrets in the wind. The house had character, old wooden floors that creaked underfoot and vintage wallpaper peeling at the edges. I felt a twinge of unease the first time I walked through the door, but I shrugged it off. It was just an old house, after all. The first few days passed without incident. I watered her plants, took care of her cat, Whiskers, and settled in for evenings of TV and snacks. But as the sun set and darkness enveloped the house, I felt an unsettling chill creeping through the halls. It wasn't just the cold. It was an oppressive heaviness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. One night, as I was settling into bed, I heard a faint whispering coming from the hallway. I sat up, straining to listen. It sounded like a conversation. Soft, unintelligible murmurs. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, almost beckoning. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed down the hallway. The moment I stepped into the dim light of the hall, I felt an icy breeze wash over me, sending shivers down my spine. I peered into the living room, but it was empty. Just shadows dancing on the walls. The whispers faded as I moved deeper into the house, and I was about to turn back when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the hallway, quick and fleeting. I squinted, but there was nothing there. My heart raced, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was imagining things. Old houses have a way of playing tricks on your mind, I reasoned. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, convinced that something was lurking just outside my door. The next day, I decided to distract myself by cleaning the house. As I dusted the shelves and wiped down surfaces, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around frequently, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Whiskers, the cat, seemed on edge too. He followed me from room to room, his fur standing on end as he stared at the corners of the house. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They echoed through the halls, rising and falling like a haunting melody. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. It felt as if they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Determined to confront whatever was haunting the house, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers seemed to swell as I walked, filling the air with a sense of urgency. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." The whispers abruptly stopped. Silence fell over the house, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I stood there, breathless, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again, a shadow at the end of the hall, darker than the darkness surrounding it. It seemed to pulse and shift, almost as if it were alive. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward me, rushing forward in a blur. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding it as it passed through me, sending an icy shockwave through my body. I gasped and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the door, panting heavily. My mind raced with questions. What had I just seen? What did it want? My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me back to reality. It was a text from Mrs. Thompson, checking in on how I was doing. I quickly typed back, trying to sound nonchalant. Everything's great, just keeping the house tidy. But deep down, I knew I was lying. The next day, I decided I had to learn more about the house and its history. I drove to the local library, hoping to find something in the archives. After hours of digging through old records, I stumbled upon an article about the previous owners of Mrs. Thompson's house, a family who had lived there for decades before tragedy struck. The article detailed a fire that had broken out one fateful night, killing the father and leaving the mother and their 2 children devastated. As I read, a chilling thought crept into my mind. Could the whispers be those of the family? Were they trapped in the house, unable to move on? I felt a wave of sympathy for the souls that might be lingering in the shadows. That night, I returned to the house armed with the knowledge I had uncovered. I wasn't just going to cower in fear. I was going to reach out to whatever was haunting the place. Listen, I said, my voice steady as I stood in the living room. I know you're here. I can hear you. If you need help, I want to help you. You're not alone anymore. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to my astonishment, I felt a warm breeze wash over me, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to say, "Help us." With renewed determination, I gathered candles and set them up in a circle, creating a makeshift altar in the living room. I lit them one by one, feeling the warmth spread through the room. "I'm here for you," I said softly. "I'm here to listen." As the last candle flickered to life, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Shadows began to dance, swirling around the candles like a gentle breeze. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost soothing. Suddenly, I felt a presence beside me. I turned, expecting to see something horrifying, but instead I was met with a feeling of warmth and love. The shadows seemed to take shape, forming a figure that resembled a woman holding 2 small hands. Her face was sad, but her eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, and in that moment, I understood. They were lost, but now they had a chance to find peace. The shadows began to fade, the room brightening with a warm glow. I watched in awe as the figure and the children disappeared, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of calm. The whispers faded, replaced by a gentle silence that enveloped me. I knew then that I had helped them find their way. From that night on, the house felt different. The heaviness lifted, and I no longer felt like I was being watched. Instead, I felt at peace. When Mrs. Thompson returned, I told her everything, and she smiled, her eyes misting over. "I knew the house had a story," she said. "Thank you for listening." As I left the Thompson home for the last time, I felt a sense of closure. The shadows in the hallway had found their way home, and I had helped them do it. Story the end.
Story number 5.
House sitting was supposed to be easy money. My friend Sarah asked me to look after her grandmother's house for a week while she was out of town, and I jumped at the chance. Sarah's grandmother, who had recently moved to a care facility, lived in an old, sprawling Victorian home that was just full of character. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy from the moment I stepped inside. The house was filled with antique furniture, faded portraits, and memories that seemed to cling to the walls. There was a heavy atmosphere in the air that I couldn't quite shake. I did my best to ignore it, reminding myself that I was just here to water the plants, feed the cat, and keep an eye on the place. On my first night, after a long day of unpacking and settling in, I decided to explore. I walked through the narrow hallways, admiring the old photographs of Sarah's family. That's when I noticed the door leading to the attic. It was slightly ajar, an invitation I couldn't resist. As I pushed the door open, a rush of stale air escaped from the attic, making me shiver. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to guide me through the darkness. The attic was filled with boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs. It smelled musty, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. And then I saw it. A doll sitting alone on a shelf in the corner, her porcelain face cracked, and her glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. She was dressed in a faded blue dress that looked like it had been made decades ago. Something about her unnerved me, but I couldn't look away. It was like she was beckoning me to come closer. I stepped toward the doll, curiosity overpowering my hesitation. As I reached out to touch her, a cold breeze swept through the attic, making me shudder. I pulled my hand back and turned to leave, but I could have sworn I heard a soft giggle behind me, light and airy, like a child's laughter. I froze. My heart raced as I glanced back at the doll. The giggle faded into silence, leaving me feeling even more uneasy. I hurried downstairs, shaking off the chill that had settled in my bones. The next day was uneventful. I watered the plants, played with Sarah's grandmother's cat, and tried to forget about the doll in the attic. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway. It was soft at first, like someone gently knocking on the wall. I sat up, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the silence of the house. It sounded like it was coming from the attic. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and flicked on the flashlight, forcing myself to get out of bed. As I climbed the stairs, the tapping stopped abruptly. I reached the attic door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The air felt charged, as if something was waiting for me on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. The attic was dark, but I could still make out the outline of the doll on the shelf. To my horror, she was no longer facing the wall. Her head was turned toward me, staring with those glassy eyes. Panic surged through me. I backed away, ready to flee, but something caught my attention on the floor. A small dusty shoe lay near the doll's shelf, one that looked like it belonged to a child. I picked it up, and the moment I did, a cold gust of wind swept through the attic, rattling the old windows. I dropped the shoe, heart pounding, and turned to leave. That's when I heard it again, a soft giggle, closer this time, like it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the doll, staring, unblinking. I raced down the stairs and locked the attic door behind me, my breath coming in quick gasps. I decided I needed to get some sleep and forget about the creepy doll. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, the sound of the giggling echoing in my mind. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented. The sunlight streamed through the windows, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had just imagined everything. But as I made my way to the kitchen, I noticed the cat staring intently at the attic door. Ears perked, tail twitching nervously. Okay, I said to myself. I need to face this. I poured myself a cup of coffee and steeled my nerves. After breakfast, I returned to the attic, determined to confront whatever was happening. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, pushing it open slowly. The air felt heavier this time, thick with tension. I approached the shelf, eyeing the doll warily. As I reached out to touch her, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread wash over me. Just as my fingers brushed against her porcelain face, the attic door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, heart racing. What the hell? I yelled, panic rising within me. The room seemed to darken, shadows creeping along the walls. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, shouting for help. Suddenly, the doll's head tilted slightly, and I heard the giggle again, clearer this time. Stay and play, it whispered. Forever. I froze, terror coursing through me. I turned back to the doll, and to my horror, her eyes were no longer glassy. They were alive, swirling with an unsettling darkness. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. In that moment of sheer panic, I focused on the door, willing it to open. I grasped the handle and pulled with all my might. To my relief, the door swung open, and I stumbled out of the attic, gasping for air. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tightly. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to leave. I packed my things in a frenzy, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back at the attic door, convinced that I could feel the doll's eyes on me, watching my every move. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The road stretched ahead, but the nagging sense of dread clung to me like a shadow. I swore I saw a figure standing in the attic window as I glanced back at the house, a small silhouette waving goodbye. Weeks later, I told Sarah what happened, and she laughed it off, convinced I was just overreacting. But I knew what I saw and heard. To this day, I avoid that old Victorian house, and the thought of that doll still sends shivers down my spine. I often wonder if it still sits in the attic, waiting for the next unsuspecting house sitter to come and play. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had just finished college and was eager to earn some extra cash before starting my first job. So when my neighbor, Mrs. Harrington, asked me to house sit for her while she went on vacation, I didn't think twice. She had a lovely home, and it seemed like a perfect opportunity to earn some money while enjoying a bit of peace and quiet. Mrs. Harrington was an elderly woman with a penchant for old-timey music. Her house was filled with vintage records and a beautifully maintained piano that had been in her family for generations. As she handed me the keys, she gave me a stern warning. "Just stay away from the attic, dear. It's not safe up there." I nodded, thinking she was just being overprotective. After all, it was just an attic. How dangerous could it be? The first few days were uneventful. I watered the plants, played with her cat, and enjoyed the peaceful ambiance of the house. I even found some of Mrs. Harrington's records and spent the evenings listening to music, allowing myself to relax. But as night fell, a strange feeling settled over me. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and shadows danced in the corners of my vision. On the fourth night, I was lounging in the living room, flipping through channels on TV, when I heard it, a soft melody drifting down from the attic. At first, I thought it was just the music from one of the records, but it was different. It was a haunting, lullaby-like tune that seemed to call to me. Curiosity piqued. I turned off the TV and listened. The melody flowed through the air, sweet and sorrowful, wrapping around me like a gentle breeze. I felt an irresistible urge to investigate. I knew Mrs. Harrington had warned me, but I couldn't resist the pull of that music. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the attic door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the creaky stairs, the melody grew louder, more enchanting. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment, but I finally twisted it open and stepped into the attic. The attic was dimly lit, filled with dust and shadows. I scanned the room, searching for the source of the music. The melody echoed through the space, but there was no visible source, no radio, no record player, just silence. Then I saw it, a beautiful, ornate music box sitting on an old trunk in the far corner. It was intricately carved, with delicate flowers etched into its surface. The lid was slightly ajar, and the soft music poured out, enchanting and eerie. As I approached the music box, I felt an overwhelming sense of nostalgia wash over me. It was as if the melody was tugging at my heartstrings, reminding me of something I couldn't quite place. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cool wood. Suddenly, the music stopped. A chilling silence filled the attic, and I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The air grew heavy, and I shivered. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. "Is anyone here?" No answer, just the oppressive silence. I stepped back, unease settling in my stomach. Maybe I should leave, I thought. But before I could turn around, the music box sprang to life again, this time playing a different tune, an upbeat, joyous melody that filled the attic with warmth. I couldn't help but smile, drawn to the music once more. It felt familiar, like a memory buried deep within me. I found myself swaying gently, caught in the spell of the melody. But as I did, I noticed something strange. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to writhe and twist, moving in time with the music. A chill ran down my spine. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. "This is just a trick of the light," I muttered to myself. "It's just an old music box." But then I heard a voice, soft and distant, whispering my name. "Elena," it called, echoing in the stillness. "Elena, come play." I froze, heart racing. The voice was sweet but laced with a sinister undertone. I turned to run, but the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. "Let me out, please!" My voice echoed in the empty space, but no one answered. The music box played on, the cheerful melody contrasting with the dread that settled over me. I felt the shadows closing in, twisting and turning around me. They seemed to take shape, forming dark figures that danced to the rhythm of the haunting tune. "Come and play with us, Elena," the voice whispered again, this time closer. I could feel their presence, cold and unyielding, as they moved around me. "We just want to play." The shadows swirled around me, their laughter rising in a cacophony that drowned out the music. I was surrounded, the darkness pressing in, threatening to consume me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I remembered Mrs. Harrington's warning. The attic wasn't safe. There was something wrong with the music box. In a burst of adrenaline, I rushed toward it, determined to stop the music. I yanked the lid shut, and the melody abruptly cut off, plunging the attic into silence. The shadows hesitated, and for a moment the air felt lighter. "Let me out!" I shouted again, and this time I slammed my shoulder against the door, desperate to escape. The door burst open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I just ran down the stairs, heart racing. I bolted through the front door, not stopping until I reached my car parked in the driveway. As I drove away, I could still hear that haunting melody echoing in my mind. It felt like a warning, a reminder of the shadows that lurked in the attic. I never returned to Mrs. Harrington's house, and I made sure to warn her about the music box when she returned. "Just stay away from the attic," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something not right about it." Mrs. Harrington nodded, her expression grave. "I know, dear. That's why I never let anyone go up there." As I walked away, I glanced back at the old house one last time, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I could have sworn I saw a shadowy figure peeking out from the attic window, its dark eyes watching me as I drove away. From that day on, I vowed never to ignore the warnings of a house, because sometimes it's better to stay away from the places where shadows dance and melodies linger. A reminder that not all music is meant to be heard. Story the end.
Story number 7.
House sitting had always seemed like an easy gig to me, but nothing could prepare me for what happened at the Mitchell's house. When my friend Jenny asked me to look after her family's home for a week while they were away on vacation, I jumped at the chance. The Mitchells lived in an old colonial-style house with creaky floors and a history that lent it a certain charm. Jenny had told me the house was a little eerie at night, but I shrugged it off. I was used to being alone. What could possibly happen? The first couple of nights passed without incident. I enjoyed cozy evenings watching TV and eating snacks, with the only company being Jenny's overly affectionate golden retriever Max. But on the third night, everything changed. It was a stormy evening, with rain pouring down and thunder rumbling in the distance. I settled on the couch with a blanket, Max curled up next to me, snoring softly. I turned on the TV, hoping the flickering light would drown out the storm. As the wind howled outside, I began to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. The house creaked and groaned, and just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the walls. It was faint but persistent, like fingernails scraping against wood. I turned to Max, who had lifted his head, ears perked, eyes darting toward the wall. "Did you hear that, boy?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. But as soon as I said it, the tapping stopped. I listened intently, but there was only silence. Shaking off my nerves, I attributed it to the storm, perhaps branches brushing against the house. I returned to my show, but the tapping resumed, louder this time, echoing through the walls. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. The sound grew more frantic, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I stood up, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. I walked to the nearest wall, placing my ear against it, and that's when I heard it. A faint whispering layered over the tapping. "Help! Help us!" it seemed to say. My blood ran cold. I pulled away from the wall, heart pounding. This wasn't just the wind or my imagination. Something was definitely wrong. "Max!" I called out, but he remained still, as if sensing the change in the atmosphere. I decided to investigate further, driven by a strange compulsion. I tiptoed toward the attic door, the source of the sound now undeniably drawing me in. As I climbed the stairs, the temperature dropped significantly. The air felt thick and heavy, and the whispering grew louder. I reached for the attic door and hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming for me to turn back. But the voices were beckoning me closer. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, and my flashlight flickered to life, illuminating the dusty attic filled with old boxes and cobwebs. The tapping was louder now, and the whispers were almost frantic. "Help us," they cried, echoing in the confined space. I stepped inside, scanning the room for the source of the sound. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the attic, the shadows stretching around me like fingers reaching out. Just then, I noticed an old trunk in the corner, half covered in dust. I approached it, the whispers intensifying as I got closer. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the trunk were calling to me. I hesitated, wondering what I might find inside, but the tapping became frantic again, echoing through my mind. Against my better judgment, I knelt down and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, I found a collection of old toys, faded photographs, and a small, tattered blanket. My heart sank as I recognized one of the photographs. It was of Jenny when she was a child, playing with a small doll. The whispers grew desperate. "Help us! We can't get out!" Suddenly, I felt a cold rush of air behind me, and I turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. It was a girl, no older than 10, with hollow eyes and a sad smile. She wore an old-fashioned dress, tattered and worn, and her hair hung in loose curls around her face. "Who are you?" I stammered, backing away slowly. "I'm Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "I need your help. We're trapped." I felt my heart pound in my chest. Trapped? By what? Emily pointed toward the wall. "In the walls, we can't get out. They won't let us." Fear washed over me. I could feel the weight of something oppressive in the room, an unseen force that made it hard to breathe. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, desperate to help, but terrified at the same time. "Find the others," she pleaded. "They're lost, just like me." Just as I was about to respond, the attic door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. I screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers crescendoed, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. "Help us! Help us!" In a moment of sheer panic, I turned back to Emily, who was now standing closer, her expression turning from pleading to something darker. "You have to help us, or we'll be stuck here forever," she said, her voice echoing ominously. I took a step back, terror coursing through me. "I can't. I don't know how." The room began to shake, and the whispers turned into screams. Shadows danced around me, closing in, and I felt as if the very walls were constricting, trapping me in this nightmare. "Please, you have to help us." Emily's voice pierced through the chaos, and in that moment, I realized I couldn't just leave them. I had to find a way to help. I focused on the trunk, feeling a surge of determination. "What do I need to do?" I shouted over the din. "Find the doll," Emily urged, pointing to a corner of the attic where a small, dusty doll lay forgotten. I sprinted toward it, grabbing the doll and holding it tightly. "I have it. What now?" "Bring it to the light," she cried, and the room trembled even more. I ran back to the trunk, where a small window allowed a sliver of moonlight to shine through. As I held the doll up to the light, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a whirlwind. "Release us! Set us free!" In that moment, I felt a warmth spread through me, a connection that tied me to the spirits trapped within the walls. I closed my eyes and concentrated, willing the energy to flow from me into the doll. Suddenly, a blinding light engulfed the attic, and I felt a rush of wind as the shadows lifted, the screams fading into whispers of gratitude. The attic door creaked open, and the air became lighter. I opened my eyes to find the room transformed. Emily stood before me, smiling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and clear. "We can finally be free." With that, she vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace. The attic was quiet now, and I could feel the oppressive weight lifting from the walls. I stumbled back, still holding the doll. The storm outside had calmed, and the house felt different, brighter and more inviting. I knew then that the spirits had been freed, and my heart swelled with relief. I made my way down to the living room, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. Max greeted me with a wagging tail, oblivious to the ordeal I had just faced. When the Mitchells returned home, I told Jenny everything. She listened intently, her eyes wide with disbelief. "That doll? I remember it from when I was a kid. My grandmother always said it was special." I smiled, knowing it was indeed special, special enough to help lost souls find their way home. From that day on, I vowed to respect the warnings of a house, because sometimes what lies within the walls is far more than just memories. It's the spirits of those who have been trapped, waiting for someone to set them free. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When my friend Mark asked me to house sit for him while he traveled abroad, I jumped at the chance. He lived in an old Victorian house at the edge of town, a place filled with character and history. I'd spent plenty of time there, but I'd never been alone in the house before. Little did I know that my excitement would soon turn into terror. The first night was uneventful. I settled in with a few horror movies, a bowl of popcorn, and a cozy blanket. I felt safe in the familiar surroundings, the gentle creaks of the old house, a comforting backdrop to the eerie stories on the screen. As the clock struck midnight, I finally turned off the TV, ready to get some sleep. But sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned in the large bed, feeling restless. The house seemed too quiet, and the shadows in the corners of the room felt like they were shifting, watching me. After a while, I got up to get a glass of water, hoping the cool liquid would calm my racing heart. As I wandered down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The door to the room at the end of the hall, a room I had always been told was off limits, was slightly ajar. I remembered Mark's warning, "Whatever you do, don't go into that room." My curiosity got the better of me. What could be so dangerous in there? I hesitated for a moment, the shadows of the hallway stretching out before me. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. I tiptoed toward the door, the wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. As I pushed the door open, an icy draft washed over me, sending chills down my spine. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window. Dust motes danced in the pale light, and I could barely make out the outlines of old furniture draped in white sheets. A grand piano sat silently in the corner, its keys covered in dust. As I stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to illuminate the space. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the room, the shadows seeming to shift and sway around me. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft, melancholic melody. It floated through the air like a whisper, drawing me closer to the piano. I froze, feeling a mix of fear and intrigue. The music was haunting, echoing through the empty room. I had to know where it was coming from. I approached the piano, and as I got closer, the music stopped abruptly. I felt a chill race down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer, just the silence of the room. As I examined the piano, I noticed a single sheet of music resting on the stand. The title read, "The Phantom's Lament." My heart raced as I thought of all the ghost stories I had heard about this house. What if there really was a ghost lingering here? I reached out to touch the sheet music, and as my fingers brushed against the paper, the room grew colder. I could see my breath misting in the air. The whispers returned, now swirling around me, a chorus of voices pleading and sorrowful. "Play it," they urged. "Play the music." A sense of dread washed over me, but I felt compelled to obey. I sat down at the piano, my fingers hovering over the keys. With a deep breath, I pressed down on the first note. The sound rang out, clear and sharp, breaking the heavy silence. As I played the melody, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with an otherworldly energy. I closed my eyes, allowing the music to guide my hands. The notes flowed from my fingers as if they were alive, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled the room. But then something changed. The air thickened, and the shadows around me began to shift more violently. I opened my eyes to find a figure standing at the far end of the room. A translucent woman dressed in a flowing gown, her face pale and mournful. "Stop!" she cried, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "You mustn't play that music." I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. "Why? What's happening?" "Your music awakens them," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "They've been trapped here for too long. If you continue, they will come for you." Panic surged through me, and I pulled my hands away from the piano, the music abruptly ceasing. The shadows recoiled and the room fell silent. The figure stepped closer, her expression softening. "You must leave this room. It is not safe." "Who are you?" I asked, trembling. "I am Eleanor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was once the mistress of this house. My husband, he was a cruel man. He imprisoned me here, along with my spirit and those of others who dared to defy him. The music, it binds us to this place. Is there a way to free you?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the shadows that seemed to stretch out around her. "You must destroy the piano. It is the source of our pain. Only then can we be set free." My heart raced at the thought of breaking the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, but I understood its power. I nodded, determination filling me. "I'll do it." As I stood up, I felt a surge of energy, like a weight lifting from my shoulders. The shadows began to swirl around me, becoming more chaotic as I approached the piano. "Hurry," Eleanor urged, her voice rising with urgency. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and swung it down onto the piano. The sound echoed through the room, a sickening crack as the wood splintered. The shadows writhed and twisted in fury, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of anguished cries. I struck again and again until the piano lay in ruins, its keys broken and silent. The air in the room shifted dramatically, and a wave of light washed over me, illuminating the space. The shadows began to recede, and I felt a warmth envelop me. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her form growing fainter. "You have freed us at last." The whispers faded into silence, and the room transformed. The oppressive darkness lifted, leaving a sense of peace in its wake. I turned to find Eleanor smiling at me, her spirit now glowing with a soft light. "I will finally be free," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. With one last smile, she vanished, leaving behind a calm stillness in the room. I stood there, breathless, feeling as though I had witnessed something truly miraculous. I stumbled out of the room, the door swinging shut behind me. As I made my way back to the living room, I could feel the weight of the house lifting, the shadows no longer oppressive, but rather comforting, like a protective embrace. When Mark returned home, I told him everything. He listened, wide-eyed, and I could tell he believed me. "That room, it has always been shrouded in mystery," he said. "I had no idea." From that day on, the house felt different, lighter and filled with warmth. I knew I had helped set spirits free, and I couldn't help but feel proud of what I had done. I promised myself I would never forget Eleanor and the courage it took to face the darkness, knowing that sometimes the most haunting melodies can lead to the most beautiful endings. Story the end.
Story number 9.
House sitting for my cousin Clara was supposed to be a relaxing week. She lived in a charming old farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Nestled in the countryside, the house had its quirks: creaky floorboards, a strange assortment of antiques, and a sprawling yard that seemed to stretch on forever. Clara had always told me stories about how the house felt alive, but I brushed them off as childhood tales. On my first evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I made myself a cup of tea, settled into Clara's cozy living room, and prepared to enjoy a quiet night. The farmhouse felt warm and inviting, but as the sun vanished completely, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows stretched across the walls, and I could feel a chill creeping in. After an hour of binge-watching my favorite shows, I decided to explore the house a bit more. I noticed a door at the end of the hallway that I hadn't seen before. It was old and heavy, with an intricate doorknob that sparkled in the low light. My curiosity piqued. I approached the door and tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a soft whisper behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned around, heart racing, but no one was there. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the old house was playing tricks on me. I decided to head to bed, brushing off the eerie feeling that lingered in the air. That night, I was awakened by a scratching sound. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of nails against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just a branch scraping against the window. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more insistent. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and stepped into the hallway. I followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the mysterious door. I stood in front of it, my pulse quickening. Should I open it? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Just then, the scratching grew frantic, like something was desperate to get out. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob. To my surprise, the door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that spiraled down into the darkness. An icy draft blew up from the abyss, sending shivers down my spine. I felt an inexplicable urge to go down, to see what was hidden below. I descended the stairs slowly, my phone's flashlight illuminating the walls, revealing peeling paint and cobwebs. The scratching intensified, echoing in the confined space. "What is down here?" I whispered to myself, fear gripping me. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the only furniture was an old rocking chair in the corner. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. There were scratches on the walls, long and deep, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I raced to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on it, my heart racing. "Let me out, please!" In that moment of desperation, I heard it again. The whisper, but this time it was clearer, more urgent. "You shouldn't have come down here." I spun around, scanning the room, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the corner, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall and indistinct, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. My stomach twisted with fear. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I am the Watcher," it said, its voice low and echoing, sending chills down my spine. "I guard this place. You must leave." "Leave? I can't. The door won't open," I yelled, panic flooding my mind. "The house is not yours to explore," the Watcher said. "It is bound to the family, but you are not of this lineage. You've awoken something you shouldn't have." "What did I awaken?" I asked, heart racing. The Watcher stepped closer and I could see its face, or what might have been a face. Hollow eyes, and a mouth that seemed to stretch in a permanent grimace. "The spirits of those who were trapped here. They hunger for freedom, and they will take you if you don't leave." Before I could respond, the room shook violently, and the air around me crackled with energy. The whispers grew louder, now filled with anger and desperation. I felt the walls closing in, the shadows twisting and writhing. "Leave now, or they will claim you," the Watcher warned, gesturing toward the shadows that began to swirl around me. In a surge of adrenaline, I ran toward the door, pounding on it with all my strength. "Help! Let me out!" Suddenly, the door burst open and I stumbled backward into the hallway. I didn't stop to look back, racing up the stairs and into the light of the living room. I collapsed on the couch, panting and wide-eyed. The house was eerily quiet, but I knew something was still watching me. I stayed up all night, heart racing, every creak of the house sending me into a panic. The sun finally rose, casting warm light throughout the rooms, but the sense of dread remained. The next morning, I packed my things, determined to leave the farmhouse behind. Just as I was about to step outside, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the watcher was still with me, lurking in the shadows. I rushed out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, I could see the farmhouse fading in my rearview mirror, but I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, waiting for my return. Weeks later, Clara called to check on me. I told her about the strange happenings, but she laughed it off as a wild imagination. I wanted to believe her, but I could never shake the feeling that the watcher was still there, guarding the secrets of the house, waiting for someone else to awaken what should have stayed buried. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the whispers calling my name, urging me to come back. Story the end.
Story number 10.
When my friend Jenna asked me to house sit for her while she was away on vacation, I was thrilled. Jenna lived in an old colonial home that had once belonged to her grandparents. The place was filled with memories, and I had always loved hearing her stories about growing up there. I was looking forward to a week of solitude, nestled in the heart of the countryside. The first night, I settled in comfortably. After making dinner, I curled up on the couch with a movie and a cozy blanket. The house was silent, save for the creaking of the old wood and the gentle whistling of the wind outside. As I watched the film, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off as paranoia. Later that evening, I headed upstairs to Jenna's old bedroom, a space filled with vintage posters and childhood memorabilia. As I got ready for bed, I heard a soft thud coming from down the hall. I paused, straining to listen. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. But still, I felt a twinge of unease. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a cold draft creeping through the room. My breath formed tiny clouds in the air, and I shivered. I got up to close the window, but as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hallway. A small figure stood just outside the light, barely visible in the dark. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, a strange mix of innocence and sadness. After a few moments, it vanished, leaving me with a chill that ran deep. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the days passed, the incidents escalated. I heard footsteps in the attic, whispers echoing through the hallways, and glimpses of the small figure that seemed to follow me around the house. Each time I caught a sight of it, my heart raced, but I could never make out any features. It was just a silhouette. One evening, feeling brave, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, and called out to the figure. "If you're here, I'm not afraid. You can show yourself." The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room deepened. A few moments later, I heard a soft giggle, a sound that sent chills down my spine. The figure appeared again, this time closer, its outline clearer. I could see it was a little girl, with long hair and a tattered dress that looked decades old. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, filled with both mischief and sorrow. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I want to play." As she spoke, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. "What's your name?" I asked. My curiosity piqued. "Emily," she replied, a smile breaking across her face. "Will you play hide and seek?" I hesitated, glancing around the room, unsure if this was a good idea. But there was something about her that tugged at my heartstrings. "Okay, Emily, but I want to know why you're here." "Find me," she said before darting away, her laughter ringing through the air. I took a deep breath and followed her voice, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. I raced through the house, searching each room. I could hear her giggles echoing from different corners, but every time I got close, she vanished into thin air. After a few rounds of this strange game, I found myself at the attic door. The house had always felt ominous to me, but curiosity pushed me to open it. I climbed the creaking stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was cluttered with old boxes, forgotten toys, and furniture draped in white sheets. I felt a presence, a heaviness in the air. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Over here," she whispered, and I turned to see her at the far end of the attic, near a dusty old trunk. My heart raced as I approached her. "What's in the trunk?" I asked, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. "It's my treasure," she replied, her eyes sparkling. "But it's lost." I knelt beside the trunk and opened it, revealing a collection of ovals and toys, all covered in layers of dust. "These are beautiful," I said. lifting one of the dolls into the light. "Will you play with me forever?" she asked, her tone shifting to something more desperate. I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach. "I can't stay here forever. I have to go back home." "Please," she pleaded, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't want to be alone." The atmosphere thickened, and I felt an overwhelming sorrow wash over me. I realized that Emily wasn't just a playful spirit. She was a lost child, trapped in the house for decades, seeking companionship. "Emily, you need to move on," I said softly. "You can't stay here. You deserve to be free." The air grew colder, and the shadows around her darkened. "But I don't know how," she said, her voice trembling. I thought for a moment, maybe you need to let go of these things. I gestured to the trunk filled with her toys. "What if you say goodbye to them?" She looked at the dolls with longing in her eyes, then back at me. "I don't want to forget," she whispered, tears glimmering in her eyes. "You won't forget. You'll always carry those memories with you. But holding on to them keeps you here. Letting go will set you free." Emily looked at the trunk and back at me, her expression shifting. "Will you help me?" I nodded. Together, we began to take the dolls out of the trunk, laying them gently on the floor. I could feel the weight of the house lifting as we cleared the space. Each time I placed a doll on the ground, I felt a flicker of energy, as if the room was coming to life. Once the trunk was empty, Emily smiled faintly, the sadness in her eyes replaced by a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you can go," I encouraged gently. With a flicker of light, Emily began to shimmer, her figure becoming translucent. "Will you remember me?" she asked, her voice soft and echoing. "Always," I promised, my heart aching for the little girl. And then, with a gentle wave, she vanished, leaving behind a faint glow that illuminated the attic. The air felt lighter, the heaviness dissipating as if a great weight had been lifted. I descended the stairs, the house feeling different, alive, yet peaceful. As I moved through the rooms, I no longer sensed her presence, but I could still feel her spirit lingering in the corners, grateful for the freedom she had found. The rest of my time house-sitting was quiet, filled with a newfound calm. I realized that even in the darkest places, light could still shine through. When Jenna returned, I shared my experience, and she listened intently. She told me about the history of the house and how her grandmother had often mentioned a little girl who had lived there long ago. They'd never found out what happened to her, but now I knew. As I left the farmhouse for the last time, I glanced back at the windows, feeling a sense of closure. I had not only watched over Jenna's home, but had also helped a lost soul find peace. And as I drove away, I felt a warmth in my heart, knowing that Emily was finally free. Story the end.